And we begin tonight with Flight 370. The major new clue: was it deliberately brought down? All of this comes 1 year, 4 months after that plane vanished with 239 on board. The new clues from that piece of a wing discovered on a remote island. A number etched on the side. Tonight, authorities telling ABC News it matches a Boeing 777.
Every search team sent to find MH370 was looking in the wrong place. For 11 years, two of the most expensive underwater operations in history scanned tens of thousands of square miles of ocean floor and found nothing, because every single one of them was built on a single assumption about how the plane went down that nobody questioned.
The fact that the signal disappeared, that was the unusual element. The fact that transponder, which was chirping back every time it was hit by the radar beam from air traffic control, went silent.
Flight controllers frantically tried to communicate with the airplane. Nothing. What happened?
An assumption the data never actually supported. The aircraft may have been missed by just dozens of miles. And now, for the first time, someone has gone back to prove it.
Is MH370 a crime scene? Is it a crime? Are we investigating a crime here? The possibility is certainly yes.
What everyone got wrong before we get to what changed, here is what was assumed and why it was wrong. When MH370 vanished on March 8th, 2014, the investigation centered on satellite data from the Inmarsat network. The last voice transmission from the cockpit came at 1:19 in the morning. Good night, Malaysian 370. Calm, professional, completely ordinary. Within minutes, the transponder went dark, and the aircraft disappeared from civilian radar. Military radar, reviewed days later, revealed something no one expected. MH370 had not continued toward Beijing. It had turned hard west, crossing back over the entire Malay Peninsula and flying into airspace it was never supposed to enter. That maneuver was not the action of a failing machine. It was deliberate, controlled, and it meant someone or something had redirected the aircraft while 239 people sat in the cabin behind them.
Malaysia's transport minister confirmed that the pilot of missing Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 had plotted a flight path into the Indian Ocean, where the plane is believed to have flown before it disappeared 2 years ago.
Even after radar lost the plane over the Andaman Sea, automated handshakes between the aircraft and the Inmarsat satellite network continued for nearly 7 hours, confirming that MH370 was still airborne and flying deep into the southern Indian Ocean until its fuel ran out. Those signals formed a broad arc. They could estimate distance and timing. But here is the catch. The satellite data never revealed the aircraft's altitude, its speed at the end, or the angle at which it entered the water. It said nothing about whether MH370 glided, spiraled, or dove straight down. On the questions that mattered most for determining where the plane actually hit the ocean, the data was completely silent. That silence was filled with an assumption.
We have some news in the search for the passenger plane that vanished 12 days ago. Tonight, the leading edge of the search has dramatically narrowed, zeroing in on 2 sections of ocean.
Investigators assumed that after fuel exhaustion, MH370 descended in a relatively stable, shallow manner, gliding downward in a controlled or semi-controlled path before striking the surface. If the descent was shallow, then the impact point would fall close to the final satellite arc. If the impact was gentle, then debris would enter the water in a predictable pattern. Ocean drift models could then estimate where fragments would travel over months and years. That single assumption shaped everything. Search grids were drawn around it. Priority zones were defined by it. Billions of data points were filtered through it. Tens of thousands of square miles of seabed were scanned based on it. 2 massive operations, one government-led from 2015 to 2017, and a second by the private marine robotics firm. Ocean, Infinity in 2018, deployed the most advanced sonar technology ever used in an underwater search. Combined, they covered an area larger than the state of Pennsylvania.
It's truly a one-of-a-kind operation with 8 AUVs on one vessel. It provides a capability to search a vast part of the seafloor in a very short time period, and it's very efficient, so it's really a perfect tool for this kind of search.
Both found nothing. To the public, this seemed impossible. A Boeing 777 is one of the largest commercial aircraft ever built. How could 2 separate teams with 2 generations of technology and hundreds of millions of dollars both fail? The answer is not complicated. It is devastating. Both searches were built on the same foundational logic. What changed between them was not the core assumption. It was how thoroughly that assumption was executed. They searched different sections of the same wrong area. Alternative interpretations existed. Independent researchers proposed them. But those voices were drowned out by the scale and authority of the official framework. The assumption about a shallow descent was never proven. It was accepted. And for over a decade, it was never seriously revisited. That is, until one researcher decided to ask a different question entirely. The question nobody asked. In the years after the second search failed, most of the world moved on. Governments stepped back. Funding dried up. Media coverage faded. MH370 settled into a kind of permanent background ache, too painful to revisit, impossible to forget. But not everyone stopped working. Among the independent researchers who continued analyzing the case was Richard Godfrey, an aerospace engineer who had spent years quietly rebuilding the MH370 problem from the ground up. Where official teams had moved on, Godfrey kept running numbers. He pulled apart drift models. He cross-referenced seasonal current data with fragment recovery dates. He treated every piece of washed-up wreckage not as confirmation of existing theory, but as a witness with its own testimony. The moment that changed his understanding came not from a new discovery, but from an old one. When he ran the drift calculations backward from the Réunion Island flaperon, accounting for monsoon reversals and seasonal surface flow that earlier models had smoothed over, the trajectory did not trace back to the zones that had been searched. It traced back to a region that had never been scanned. He ran it again with fragments from Mozambique, then Madagascar, then South Africa. The paths kept converging on the same area. While official investigations had used debris as confirmation, plugging recovered fragments into existing models to see if they matched, Godfrey and a small network of analysts took the opposite approach. They stopped asking where debris might go from a presumed crash site. Instead, they asked, given where and when each fragment was actually found, where must it have come from? That reversal changed everything. When the MH370 flaperon washed ashore on Réunion Island in 2015, it provided the first undeniable physical proof that the aircraft had crashed into the Indian Ocean. Over the following years, more fragments appeared along the coasts of Mozambique, Madagascar, and Tanzania, and South Africa. Each piece was authenticated and cataloged. But under the original framework, debris served mainly as a rubber stamp. Investigators assumed a crash location first, ran drift simulations forward, and checked whether the fragments appeared roughly where expected. When they did not align, the discrepancies were explained away. Unpredictable currents, random chance, background noise. The weakness of that approach was brutal in its simplicity. It assumed the starting point was already correct. The reversed method treats each fragment as dynamic data. Every piece of wreckage carries three critical inputs: the location where it washed ashore, the approximate time it arrived, and the seasonal behavior of ocean currents during its drift. Monsoon patterns, current reversals, surface flow velocities. These are no longer treated as unpredictable noise. They are treated as core evidence. By running drift models backward from shorelines into the open ocean, the analysis identifies convergence zones. Regions where debris paths from multiple fragments, found years apart and in different seasons, consistently trace back toward the same area. Not a single point, but an overlapping zone that tightens with every fragment added to the model. But here is the catch. Some of the debris that had been previously dismissed as anomalous, fragments that arrived too far north or too late to match the original models, suddenly made perfect sense under the reversed framework. The inconsistencies that were once swept aside became the most valuable data points of all. The evidence was never wrong. It was just being asked the wrong question. And when Godfrey and his colleagues followed that evidence to its conclusion, it did not point back toward the areas that had already been searched. It pointed somewhere else entirely. If stories like this keep you up at night, hit subscribe, because what comes next changes everything about this case. The steep dive. When the assumptions are stripped away, a very different picture of MH370's final moments begins to emerge. And it is far more violent than anyone originally modeled. The revised analysis suggests the aircraft did not glide. It did not descend gently. MH370 may have entered the ocean at a steep angle and at tremendous speed. A high-speed, near-vertical impact would release catastrophic energy on contact with the water. At those velocities, the ocean surface behaves almost like concrete. The aircraft's main structure would not break apart gradually. It would shatter, fragment, disintegrate on impact into thousands of pieces, many no larger than a suitcase. Large, intact sections of fuselage, the kind sonar teams were trained to look for, would be unlikely to survive. The wreckage would sink rapidly, driven into the seabed by its own momentum, scattering across a debris field potentially buried under layers of deep ocean sediment. Suddenly, the absence of a visible wreckage field is no longer a mystery. It becomes exactly what you would expect. The same logic explains why so little floating debris was ever recovered. In a shallow impact, wings and fuselage panels can tear away and remain buoyant for days or weeks. In a steep, high-speed dive, much of that material shatters into smaller, denser pieces. Most of it sinks almost immediately. What little remains afloat is small, irregular, easily scattered by wind and current. Over months, it degrades, disperses, and becomes nearly invisible across millions of square miles of open ocean. This perspective also resolves the uneven distribution of debris found along distant coastlines. Under the earlier models, some fragments appeared too far north, or arrived too late to match predicted drift paths. Those inconsistencies were treated as anomalies. In the revised scenario, they align. A compact, high-energy debris field combined with seasonal ocean currents would naturally produce scattered and delayed discoveries across a wide geographic range. And critically, the angle of impact changes where the plane came down. The original searches focused on areas close to the satellite arc, assuming a gentle descent near fuel exhaustion. But a steep dive allows the aircraft to cover additional horizontal distance in its final moments, depending on speed and remaining control. Even small differences in that terminal behavior can shift the crash site by dozens of miles. In the deep ocean, that is the difference between discovery and a decade of silence. This does not explain what happened inside the cockpit. It does not speculate about intent. It simply removes a constraint that may have narrowed the search too early. When the angle of impact changes, the point of impact must move with it. And that shift may explain why MH370 remained hidden for more than a decade, not because it left no trace, but because it fell outside the place. Everyone was looking. The new corridor. When every revised element is brought together, satellite timing, fuel endurance, atmospheric conditions, and the reversed debris drift, the data does not expand into wider uncertainty. It compresses, it converges, and it points to a new search corridor. This corridor still traces back to the same Inmarsat records that guided earlier efforts. The raw data has not changed. What has changed is the interpretation. The new model no longer assumes a shallow descent or a wide debris spread. Fuel estimates are recalculated alongside wind behavior and upper atmosphere conditions during the aircraft's final hours. When these factors are aligned, they consistently point toward the same narrow band of ocean. The result is a search zone, dramatically smaller than the vast regions scanned during the first two missions. Instead of tens of thousands of square miles, uncertainty compresses into a far tighter area. But here is the catch. This new corridor sits just outside the boundaries of the areas that were previously searched, close enough to explain why earlier missions nearly intersected the wreckage, far enough to explain why they ultimately found nothing. On a map, the shift looks modest, a nudge really, compared to the vast ocean around it. In 3 miles of water, it is everything. The difference between a sonar pass that captures wreckage and one that sweeps past it in total silence, recording nothing but featureless seabed. This also explains something that haunted investigators for years. During the 2018 search, Ocean Infinity's autonomous vehicles had occasionally picked up faint sonar returns near the edges of their scan grids, contacts that were logged but never fully investigated because they fell outside the priority zones defined by the existing model. Under the revised framework, some of those peripheral readings suddenly become far more interesting. They sit in exactly the kind of boundary region where the new corridor overlaps with the old search limits. This precision is the reason the search was approved again. For years, proposals to restart the hunt were rejected because they offered no fundamentally new approach. Same data, same conclusions, same endless ocean. This time, researchers did not ask for more ocean to scan. They asked to test a specific correction. By narrowing the corridor instead of widening it, they demonstrated this was not a repetition of past efforts. It was a focused verification of whether a single flawed assumption had quietly pulled the entire search in the wrong direction for over a decade. That argument was enough. Ocean Infinity agreed to return to the southern Indian Ocean. Back in the water. On December 30th, 2025, the renewed search for MH370 officially began. There were no dramatic announcements, no press conferences full of promises. The operation restarted with one clear, disciplined purpose: to test a hypothesis, not to sweep the seabed blindly, but to challenge the new corridor with real sonar data and see if it holds. The vessel deployed by Ocean Infinity carried the same class of autonomous underwater vehicles that had been used in 2018, but this time they were not being sent into a vast, uncertain grid. They were being sent into a narrow corridor with defined edges and a clear prediction of what should be found inside it. Every pass of the sonar was not just a search, it was a test. If the corridor was wrong, the data would show it. If the corridor was right, the surrounding areas would come back clean, while the target zone would eventually yield a signal. From the very first phase, the approach was different from anything that came before. High-resolution sonar began scanning targeted areas, and the team immediately started eliminating zones. Not searching blindly, eliminating. Each section of seabed cleared of wreckage did not represent failure. It represented precision. It tightened the remaining search space and strengthened confidence in the corridor that survived. Early results moved in a direction that no one publicly expected. A substantial portion of surrounding seabed has already been ruled out. The regions that remain are smaller, more defined, and more testable than at any point in the investigation's history. No announcement has been made claiming the aircraft has been located. That silence is deliberate. Sonar data requires careful verification, and every signal must be cross-checked before conclusions are drawn. But the absence of wreckage in surrounding zones is itself significant. It directly validates the methodology. It means the model is not being contradicted. It is being confirmed, piece by piece, through the process of elimination. There is another critical difference this time. This search has an endpoint. If the aircraft is not found within the defined corridor, the hypothesis itself will be questioned. That level of accountability did not exist before. Previous missions scanned endlessly, and finding nothing proved nothing. This mission was designed so that absence of evidence would carry real, measurable meaning. For the first time in over a decade, the search for MH370 is not driven by hope or politics or pressure from grieving families. It is driven by a testable idea, and the early data is not contradicting it. The ending nobody expects. Here is the question that should keep you up tonight. What if MH370 has been sitting just dozens of miles outside the original search grid this entire time, close enough that earlier sonar teams may have passed within range without ever knowing it? What if 11 years of failure was not a story about an impossible ocean, but about a single wrong assumption that nobody had the nerve to challenge until now? The ships are back. The sonar is live. The corridor is narrowing. And for the first time, the search is built on evidence that was always there, but never properly read. If you want to know what happens next, subscribe and turn on notifications. This story is not over, and when that wreckage is found, everything changes. Smash that like button if this shifted how you see the MH370 case, and drop your theory in the comments. Do you think they finally got it right this time? Because 239 people are still waiting for an answer. and we may be weeks away from getting one.